This is Swim, Success with Music. Hey, what's going on, everybody? This is Walt. Again, this is Success with Music. We call this show Swim for short. I am your music coach, your genre mashup master, your polka experimental rapper. Yeah, I know, that made no sense. Yo, let's dive in. Hey, what's going on, y'all? Again, this is Walt. This is Success with Music. This is a podcast designed specifically for musicians. We are about that music life. I appreciate you tuning in wherever you happen to be in the world. I hope you're well. And if you've been keeping up with us in the past couple of weeks or so, we've been working to learn about music theory. So for those of you who are a bit intimidated by music theory or just getting started with it, or you're having it in lessons, or you've been told that is something you need to know, we are trying to uncover some of the basic foundational pieces of music theory. And today we're going to continue on in that, in talking about the formula for the major scale. If you've missed any of the episodes specifically with music theory, please go back to the previous weeks so that you can get caught up, because we are building a foundation. Again, this is incredibly important for those who are just trying to get an understanding of how this whole thing works. All right, so we'll get to that in a second. And before we do, it's the top of the show, so I want to bring some interesting facts for you today. So preparing for the show, I came across some music related facts. Now, I didn't independently verify the truthfulness to these things, but they seem kind of legit. So, if I'm wrong, then, I'm guilty of passing on bad information, but I think most of these are correct. And, check these things out. Tell me if you heard about these things before in the music world. I found them pretty interesting. And again, we're talking about music facts, interesting music facts for today. Here's the first one. Do you happen to know what the most expensive instrument is or was? Apparently, the most expensive musical instrument in the world is a Stradivarius violin that sold for, anyone? $15.9 million. I mean, music gear is expensive, but man, that's next level right there. All right, next one. Your heartbeat can mimic the beat of the music you're listening to. And if you're listening to trap, you may have a heart attack. Here's another fact. People actually prefer the original versions of songs, not because they're the best thing ever, but because it's the first version they came across that they're familiar with. So a rendition may actually be better. You may have a better vocalist doing a rendition, but again, people prefer the original songs because it's the first thing they came across. They're used to it. All right. For you botanists out there, in 2007, a study found that music, especially classical music, helps plants grow. I'm not even sure what to do with that one, but anyhow, let's go on to the next fact here. Favorite songs are favorites because they're associated with an intense emotional event in your life. Like going to a dance or a prom, or you're on vacation. That music kind of makes a significant mark in your life because of things like that. Again, emotional events. And we kind of talked about that in the previous episode, how music is fused with emotions. All right, let's keep going. Listening to a happy or sad song not only affects your mood, but can change your perception of the world around you. So if you're sitting there listening to your apocalyptic music, you may think that the world is going to blow up and it's on fire. All right, last one. Leo Fender. Hopefully you heard that last name before, Fender. Leo Fender, who developed the first solid body electric guitar and electric bass guitar, never learned to play either instrument. What kind of hypocrisy is that? Bro, play what you made. All right, so that's all I have. Let's go ahead and move into our main topic of the day, which again, as I mentioned, we're talking about the major scale formula. So last week, I said that we'll get into that formula, and of course we will, but let's do a quick recap on something I mentioned before. I said music theory overall is a principle-based subject. Now, it's a systematic approach to understanding, playing, and creating music. Now, a better way to think about this is to see music theory, and we kind of talked about this last week, like recipes for your favorite foods. Now, I don't know about you, but if I have a great meal somewhere, after enjoying that meal, the number one thing I'm thinking about is, man, I would like to relive that experience all over again. So there's this pizza place on the other side of town, and they're like, 30 minutes away. This place is my hands down favorite place, pizza place specifically, because they're good and because they are incredibly consistent. Like the amount of cheese, how much meat is on the pizza, the right amount of sauce, the way they cut it, the temperature, the whole thing. They are incredibly, very, very consistent. Now, and this may not be a big deal to you, but when I go to places like this, I hate it when you get, you order your pizza. One day it's good. The next day, it's all right. I hate that. But this place, again, is consistent. And the whole thing that they do, everything that they put into their process is basically their recipe, of course, for the pizza. But they have a formula, something that they're doing with the workers or their training. Something happening there is very, very consistent to the point where their products turn out the same over and over and over again. And music theory is kind of like that. It gives you a formula. It gives you different recipes. If you follow those recipes closely, you should be able to replicate anything in music. And that's why, if you think about it, we have sheet music or we have chord charts, those types of things. You should be able to replicate the original over and over again with a lot of precision. And we're going to talk about the formula or recipe for the major scale. All right. So like any recipe, you're going to first need the right ingredients, and you'll have to have the right measurements for these ingredients. Now, based off of what we discussed last week, we do have some of those ingredients in front of us. If you recall, they are the letters of the alphabet. They represent notes. Now, more specifically, in music, we only use the first 7 letters of the alphabet: A, B, C, D, E, F, G. Now, when we were last together, I also mentioned that there are tones between some of the letters that I just mentioned. Not every single one, but between certain letters, there are these other tones. Now, if we were to account for all of the tones between the 7 letters, which again represents notes, we would wind up with a total of 12 tones or 12 notes that we have to work with, 12 ingredients. Now, if you remember, I said that the major scale will consist of only 7 letters, 7 tones, or 7 ingredients. So all major scales will consist of 7 ingredients, but I'm telling you that you have 12 to choose from. Which of the 12 do you need to use to create a major scale? Well, there's a formula for telling us what they are. So again, we're talking about the ingredients, of which we have 12, but we also have to talk about the measurements for the ingredients. So again, if we were making a cake, I can tell you, hey, we need sugar, but do you need a whole bucket full of sugar? Do you need a cup? Do you need half of a cup? But the point is, there has to be some type of measurement system for your ingredients, and that's what we're going to talk about today, and we're going to eventually move on to providing that recipe for you. And I'll talk about that in just a moment. But let me do this. Let me play all 12 tones for you, because we're going to talk about the measurements here for those tones here in just a second, and things will start to come into focus. All right. So here are the 12 tones or the 12 ingredients we have to work with. All right, so I needed to play those for you so we can talk about the measurement or the distance between neighboring tones. The distance between neighboring tones, that will become our measurements. So for instance, the distance between one tone and the very next tone is called a half step. Half step. H-A-L-F step. Half step. Again, it's the note that comes right after another. Let me play you a few examples of half steps. Now, for me, a good way to remember when I'm hearing a half step is to think about the music from the movie Jaws. And depends on how old you are. Hopefully you may know about this movie. If not, I've heard it in cartoons and different things on TV and film, what have you. You should recognize this sound or these notes. Now let's go back. Let's play all 12 tones again. Now, as I play this, know that every time you hear a note and then a note after that, that is a half step. The point being is that when I'm playing all 12 tones back to back, you are hearing a succession of half steps. Let me play it. All right, now let's talk about whole steps. That's the other measurement we need for creating major scales. Again, we have the ingredients out there, but we need to know the different measuring tools that we have. So already we have the half step, but now we need one more measuring tool. We're going to call this one a whole step. Now, a whole step means instead of going to the very next note, you just skip one of those notes and land on the next. So you're kind of leapfrogging one note. Let me play what that sounds like. So when I do that, you're leapfrogging just one of the half steps. Let me do this. I'm going to play a whole bunch of whole steps in succession. Listen to what this sounds like. Sound familiar? It's kind of like that dream sequence you see like on TV or in movies where the screen gets all wavy and people start to have a dream or imagine something. When you hear that sound, that's a series of whole steps. All right, so hopefully you got that down. So we have half steps and we also have whole steps. Now, let's go back to something I mentioned last week. We'll come back to these two measurements here in just a moment. So when I played a major scale for you last week, I used, you didn't know this maybe at the time, but I used a combination of both half steps and whole steps. I used those measurements for something I played last week, which was the C major scale. Now, just to review, and you may not have this memorized, but I'll tell you, the C major scale is represented by letters C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C. At that time, I also used the words do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do. Now, today I want to take that whole concept and move just a bit further and assign each of those letters or those words, do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do. I want to give them numbers. So these numbers are kind of like placeholders, or if you think about math, they'll be our variables. If you think about algebra. If that makes no sense, let's just keep it moving. But hopefully you'll catch on in terms of what I'm talking about in just a second. So let's go back to that C major scale. So when I start with the letter C and end with the letter C, because the first and the last note repeats, if you remember, that will become our major scale. Now, in between those two C's, we have to figure out all of the notes, of which we'll talk about here in just a second. Now, the C in the C major scale, for today's purposes, will be represented by the number 1. It's the first note in the scale, so we'll call it a number 1. And if you think about that do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do thing, the word do will also be number 1. Now I'm going to do a kind of a mirror. So I'm going to bounce back and forth between the do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do, and the letters that make up the C major scale. Okay.